Hi, everybody. We are back to continue our discussion of international trade. What we were doing is utilizing our supply and demand framework, our perfectly competitive market model framework, to understand the gains from trade when we open up to free trade. And we did this last time by considering the two cases that you can see on the screen now. On the left-hand side, we have the case of an export market, where when we open up to that market, the price in the rest of the world is a little bit higher than the price we would have faced under autarky in the domestic market equilibrium. And on the right-hand side, we had an import market where the world price we faced was a lot lower, which is why it made sense to go ahead and buy the goods abroad. And in both cases, we saw that there were winners and losers created from opening up to free trade relative to the domestic market equilibrium situation under autarky when they were closed. So there were winners and losers created. However, the gains to the winners offset the losses to the losers. And that's why in both situations, we see an increase in economic efficiency as measured by the increase in the total surplus pie. Okay, and we can identify those gains from trade here diagrammatically as the area D in both situations. What we're going to do next is we're going to look at a very specific type of trade restriction known as a tariff. And a tariff applies specifically to the situation on the right. Okay, so a tariff is going to apply to our import market here because a tariff is specifically a tax on imported goods. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at a tariff. So first and foremost, definition of a tariff here is it's a tax on imports. And we'll go ahead and look at an example of the market for cotton shirts. And let's suppose in this situation, the world price is $20. So if we were open to free trade, let's take that as the status quo position now. We are already open at free trade at a price of $20. And now the government decides they're going to slap a tariff of $10 per shirt, which means consumers are going to wind up effectively paying $30 if they want to purchase an imported shirt. And this also implies then that both domestic producers and domestic consumers are going to be able to expect to be charged and be charged $30 per shirt. So in some sense, when we put a tariff on imports, what that does is it allows, or rather props up, the price of the good in a way where domestic producers can actually charge a little bit more. And they don't have to price as competitively. So in this situation, the general price facing both domestic buyers and sellers under the tariff is going to be the world price plus the size of the tariff. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at our supply and demand framework here. Okay, we had a world price down there at $20. Let's suppose the initial status quo involves under free trade, buyers purchasing 80 units at that price and domestic producers only furnishing 25. Okay, meaning the difference is accounting for our imports, which are the 55 units, the difference between 80 and 25. So this is the status quo situation. Now, what we're going to consider here is what happens when we put a tariff of $10 per shirt. And what that's going to do is effectively shift that world price line up from the perspective of domestic buyers and sellers to $30. And note, when the price goes up to 30, law of demand tells us that consumers are going to respond by buying less. Okay, and law of supply at the same time tells us that at the higher price, domestic sellers, because that price is propped up for them, are going to respond by selling more. And this does effectively reduce the quantity of imports. If that's your goal, the tariff definitely does do this. Okay, does cause the volume of trade to be restricted. However, we're going to argue here that if we look carefully and consider our surplus analysis, we'll see that the tariff also translates into efficiency loss. So again, if we were in a situation where we were freely trading with no tariff, okay, that means the world price is described by this red line at a price of $20. And the consumer surplus in that situation would be all the area below the demand curve and above that red $20 price line to the left of the quantity that the buyers buy, which is 80 units here. So the consumer surplus under free trade was A, B, C, D, E, F, and this should be familiar with what we saw in the previous video. Producer surplus under free trade. Okay, producers were the ones that kind of lost out on the gains from trade when we opened up trade from the autarky situation to an import market. So the producer surplus was the area above the supply curve, below that red price line, to the left of the quantity supplied, which was 25. So producers are taking home G in surplus. So under free trade, the entire economic pie is accounted for. We got A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Right now, we're going to shift our point of reference to the allocation that prevails under the tariff. Okay, and we're going to compare that to our status quo, which was free trade, which gave us maximal surplus. Again, the idea being, if we see that the pie shrinks, we can compare it to the size of the original pie and identify the sources of welfare loss or of that deadweight loss. So you'll note, if the price goes up to 30, okay, I think the intuition makes sense here in that that hurts consumers, right? They're not going to get A, B, C, D, E, F anymore. Their surplus is reduced to A, B. Okay, now producers, they actually benefit here, as I mentioned before, in that the tariff props up the price that they can charge. And it effectively subsidizes the producers here and incentivizes them to produce an extra 15 units, which allows them to capture the surplus C. Now remember, that area C, that used to be part of the consumer surplus. Okay, so C represents a net transfer between buyers and sellers. Buyers gave up C, sellers collected C. If that was the end of the story, then the pie would stay the same. The total surplus wouldn't change. However, we have the government to think about here. And the government also gets a piece of the pie in that they collect the revenue from the tariff. So the size of the tariff is $10. Now the tariff, remember, is only a tax on imports. So when the price is 30, okay, note that the quantity of imports is also 30. Okay, so we're going to take the size of the tax times that quantity of imports, and that'll actually be represented by this rectangle E, which is the revenue generated by the tariff. Okay, so it's really important, I think, at this point to see where E comes from. Okay, without the tariff, what was E? Well, E was right here. That was part of the consumer surplus. Okay, so when you hear economists talk about this idea that the people who actually pay a tariff are the consumers, the domestic consumers of the good, they're not being misrepresented here. That's really what's going on, is that E is coming out of what would have been the consumer surplus. So the consumers are the ones that are footing the bill for this tariff revenue. It's not Mexico, it's not China. When you put a tariff on your imports, the consumers are the ones that are effectively paying that tariff revenue. And I think this is a huge misconception, been widely misrepresented lately. So we have all three pieces of our pie accounted for here. We have our consumer surplus, AB, our producer surplus, CG, and our tariff revenue, E, which means now we can take full accounting and note that we are losing a little bit of total surplus in that we don't capture D or F anymore. Okay, what were D and F? Well, D and F were part of the consumer surplus. Okay, so was C and so was E under free trade at that lower price of $20. C was captured by the sellers. E was captured by the government. But D and F are not captured by anybody, meaning they represent to us a net welfare loss. Okay, and in this particular situation, we can actually see the welfare loss occurring from both sources simultaneously. Okay, D, that area, that represents the loss from producing too much, from actually trading too much, okay, relative to how much we would have traded at that lower price of $20. Okay, what happens when the price goes up from 20 to 30? Well, it incentivizes all these sellers on this part of the supply curve who had higher costs. Those sellers would not have been producing at a lower price of 20. But now that the price is propped up to 30, some sellers that were not the efficient sellers, okay, foreign sellers could produce at a lower cost, but now some of these less efficient domestic sellers come into the market And the point is, area D here represents bad trades that we've encouraged. It represents surplus reducing trades, okay, where we're now trading too much relative to where we would have. We've incentivized bad trades. Okay, at the same time, F represents the value of trades that we have blocked. Okay, that area F, okay, that's representing the value of what was lost when we reduced the trade from 80 down to 70. The buyers buy 10 fewer units. So there is really our classical situation of how that tax, right, is preventing some mutually beneficial trades on the buyer side. Okay, but it's really doing two things. Again, D, this area, this is deadweight loss from us producing too much, from encouraging a few bad trades. F is deadweight loss from us not buying enough, from us missing out on a few good trades. Okay, so important things to see here. That tariff, it does cause the pie to get smaller. So when you're using a tariff on your own imports, you are causing your own efficiency loss. Who pays the revenue that is raised from that tariff? Is it China? Is it the foreign sellers? The answer is no, it is not. That area E here, that came out of what was the consumer surplus under free trade. Okay, there is another way to restrict trade that's also been implemented, and this is something called an import quota. We're going to just mention this very quickly because qualitatively it's got a lot of the same properties as the tariff in that the quota, which is a mandated restriction on the quantity of imports, this winds up having the same effect. It raises the world price from the perspective of the domestic market. It reduces the quantity of imports. It hurts the buyer's welfare and increases the seller's welfare a little bit. But the big difference is that a tariff created revenue for the government, and a quota does not do that. The quota leaves what would have been generated as profits for the foreign producers of those imported goods. So when we use an import quota, we're essentially leaving that tariff revenue, okay, in the pockets of foreign producers. So in that regard, okay, we're using that import quota. We're now not capturing E. Okay, E was still coming out of the consumer's pocket under the tariff. Okay, but the import quota reduces the consumer surplus by that much. And instead of the government collecting that revenue is now left abroad. Okay, the government could do other things like auction off licenses for the right to import in order to try to capture some of these foreign profits as revenue, but it generally does not do this. So that wraps up our discussion of trade policy in the context of the competitive market framework. Hope you enjoyed, and stay tuned.